Members, we are going to take Ms. Bauer-Cahan's item. This is file item 21. File item 21, Senate Bill 357. Clerk will read.
Senate Bill 357 by Senator Wiener and others, enacting the crimes.
Ms. Bauer-Cahan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of Senator Wiener to present Senate Bill 357, which repeals provisions of the law that criminalize loitering with the intent to engage in sex work. The legislation also permits the sealing of records for anyone previously convicted of this loitering offense and provides resentencing for anyone currently incarcerated for the offense. Since its enactment in 1995, this misdemeanor offense has failed to protect public safety, and unsurprisingly, we see it disproportionately affecting Black and brown transgender women. Due to the broad nature of the offense, law enforcement has license to profile people and stop them for inherently discriminatory reasons, such as wearing revealing clothing while talking to people in an area where sex work has occurred in the past. Criminalizing people for loitering significantly increases the mistrust that we discuss often between law enforcement and targeted communities. This is detrimental to public safety because it destroys the relationship and means people will not engage with law enforcement when they need it. The loitering offense, in fact, creates unsafe environments where sexual exploitation can occur. I want to be clear that I have done work to combat human trafficking and believe deeply that we have a responsibility to do everything that we can on this floor to combat human trafficking and to hold traffickers accountable. This loitering law is not the way to do that. Criminalizing the victims and leaving them with criminal records that create further barriers to seeking employment, housing, and relief is not the answer. Leading trauma-informed and anti-trafficking organizations like Coalition to Abolish Sex Trafficking, or CAST, Asian Pacific Islander Legal Outreach, and Justice at Last understand that human trafficking survivors are harmed by this loitering law, which is why they strongly support SB 357 and urge your aye vote today. To be clear, nothing in this bill decriminalizes solicitation or engaging in prostitution or sex work. Under the bill, sex work remains illegal, and law enforcement can continue to apprehend those engaged in that activity. Furthermore, law enforcement can continue to approach and make contact with people they believe are victims of trafficking to offer their help. Sex trafficking, solicitation, and prostitution, again, will remain illegal. SB 357 simply eliminates an anti-loitering offense that results in the legal harassment of LGBTQ+ Black and brown communities for simply existing and looking like a sex worker to law enforcement. And with that, I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Ms. Bauer-Cahan. Mr. Marsucci, you're recognized.
Thank you very much. I rise in support of SB 357. As a former prosecutor, we need to make sure that we distinguish between offenses that are too ambiguous to allow for abuse. As our colleague from Miranda just stated, we have the tools in the Penal Code to continue to prosecute for solicitation for the act of prostitution. Nothing in this bill undermines that. This simply eliminates this vague provision in the Penal Code that allows for abuses for people that may simply be profiled for the wrong reasons. And for that reason, I rise in support, and I urge my colleagues to support SB 357.
Ms. Wicks, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise today in support of SB 357 and want to explain why this policy is supported by a broad coalition of district attorneys, leading anti-trafficking service providers, and LGBTQ organizations. These prosecutors, service providers, and LGBTQ groups in support of this bill are relying on both personal experience as well as national and worldwide research to understand that criminalizing sex work and those being trafficked for loitering does not help those in need. Instead, the enforcement of this offense is incredibly harmful to women, especially women of color and our transgender community, who are being disproportionately targeted by these policies. And I want to be clear that arresting someone or threatening to arrest them as means to help them is not a trauma-informed or recommended way the leading anti-trafficking servicers recommend. And organizations such as CAST, that my colleague from Orinda had mentioned, and Justice at Last, do not recommend this as a way to help those that are sex trafficked. CAST is the largest human trafficking group in the entire nation, and servicing and rescuing hundreds of thousands of people from sex trafficking. They strongly support this bill and are confident that it will help, not harm, those being sex trafficked. We should listen to them. We should listen to our former prosecutors here, my colleague from Torrance, who are supporting this bill. I think many of us would describe him as sort of a law and order Democrat, and the fact that he's supporting this bill, I think, says a lot about the strength of this bill and the fact that the author has worked tirelessly with the law enforcement community to create smart public policy that helps women, helps our transgender community, and we respectfully ask for an aye vote.
Thank you, Ms. Wicks. Mr. Colra, you are recognized.
Thank you. I rise in support of SB 357 as a former public defender who did represent victims of human trafficking, victims of sex trafficking that were caught up in the criminal justice system. And, you know, some have said that police won't be able to help or approach people who are being trafficked or who are selling sex by choice if this bill is passed. And that simply is not true. Law enforcement can help people without threatening to arrest them. It happens every day. It frankly should happen more often. And there are better ways of helping without fear and intimidation. If the only tool you give someone is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. Similarly, if the only tool we give is one of arrest, then arrest is what's going to happen. And that leads to so many other issues, as we've heard from other colleagues as well. The most effective approaches to help this population do not involve arrest. For example, anti-trafficking organizations already do outreach to sex workers and those being trafficked. Their approach of offering a helping hand, a meal, a counselor, and especially a safe place to sleep is more effective and trauma-informed. Even emergency room staff, hotel employees, and transit employees are trained to watch out for persons being trafficked and intervene appropriately. This is more effective than arrest. When law enforcement sees someone in danger or distress, they can offer to help. They can intervene, or they can summon social services or community-based groups who can help. As for minors, police retain the power to assist any minor in danger or to detain them until social services arrive. SB 357 doesn't interfere with law enforcement's ability to help or approach people. Conviction records are not helping. Threatening people with the trauma of arrest and incarceration is not helping. Voting for this bill will actually be helpful. That is why it is sponsored by Trans Latina Coalition, St. James Infirmary, and other groups like CAST, as my colleague indicated, to end exploitative trafficking. I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Colra. Ms. Valadares, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I respectfully rise in opposition to this bill. Members, I hope that we can all agree that human sex trafficking or modern-day slavery needs to be eliminated. It has no place in a modern nation, and it is shameful that it still exists. According to the State Department, California is home to 3 of the top 10 cities most known for human trafficking in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego. Our law enforcement officers work hard to help identify and rescue victims of this horrific practice and arrest those who traffic these victims. SB 357 will undermine the ability of law enforcement officers to investigate human sex trafficking and bring sex traffickers to justice. I have friends that have been on human trafficking task force that have had to arrest and had to intervene in girls trafficked at 12 years of age. And it's a cycle of abuse. And being able to separate that some of these girls, little girls, is vital in ending the cycle of abuse that is human trafficking. This bill is going to undermine that. We need to be giving law enforcement more tools to stop human trafficking, not less. We need to work through this body and helping women and girls that are being trafficked. This bill does not do that. We need to be working on bills and policy that make our communities safer. This does not do that. In fact, it's going to endanger more lives of girls in our communities. I strongly urge for your no vote. Thank you.
Members, if you'd like to participate in debate, please raise your microphones at this time. Mr. Sayarto, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too rise in opposition to this bill. This does not make communities safer. For one who has worked a long time in communities that are afflicted with this, I can tell you that it is not very hard to see where these people are hanging out on the corners, and that's why they're approached. Police are trying to remove this type of activity from communities because these communities and the families that live there do not want to be subjected to this or have their kids subjected to having to walk through these areas any more than any other family in any other community. So this also takes another tool away from law enforcement to try to help deal with this. The sex trafficking issue has been clearly talked about by several members in here and my colleague from Santa Clarita. And that's true. The police have very few tools to be able to take somebody out of the system to find out whether they do want help or not. And if they don't want help, they're not going to stay in jail. They get released. We don't even put people in jail that steal $949 worth of merchandise. They are not jailing prostitutes anymore. So there is a plethora of reasons for not doing this, but the primary one is it does not make communities safer. It does not. So we need to stop this trend of taking away the tools that our law enforcement officers need to clean up our communities. And we can help these people if we can identify them. People that are not engaged in this are not being harassed. I did not see any of that in the cities that I worked in. And believe me, if you're working or serving those communities, you better know what those folks want in those communities. Because I've heard that before. I've heard, oh, well, you don't really know what black and brown people want. You know what? Baloney. I worked with those people. I went to their, I helped those people all the time. They want the same thing everybody else wants. They want a safe, clean community. And they need help doing that, and the people that are helping them are the officers. So we need to stop taking tools away, and this bill just does that. So, I urge you to vote no on this and continue to allow our communities to be safer communities and allow our police officers to do their jobs. Thank you.
Mr. Lackey, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. And I mean not to insult your intelligence, but I'm actually going to just read to you and remind you some of the groups that are in opposition to this bill. And I think it's self-explanatory.
Without objection.
Thank you. Bay Area Anti-Trafficking Coalition, Beacons for Victims, Capital Research Institute, Child and Adult Sex Trafficking Survivors, Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking, Concerned Women for America, Freed Collective, National Center on Sexual Exploitation, Restoration Ranch and Women's Shelter, and Zoe International, just to name a few. I think those are very self-explanatory, that these are people that have committed their lives to try to protect these victims who are in this sex exploitation circumstance. My seatmate and I visited an area. It's a brand new group of people who have committed their lives to rehabilitating these young people who have been caught in this cycle of abuse. And it's reprehensible, and they reminded us of the dangers and their concerns for this bill and its passage. So please, please, listen to the voices of those who are trapped or have been trapped in this very ugly cycle. They deserve better. Thank you.
And Mr. Lowe, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. I rise as chair of the California LGBT Legislative Caucus and appreciate the comments from a number of our colleagues who identify themselves with being more on the side of law and order, and that's a space that I am very proud of as well. But from the perspective of our LGBTQ community, simply being targeted for the criminalization of potentially soliciting or the appearance of such, that's in which there's been abuses in this penal code. And when we think about the legislation at hand, principally is taking a surgical approach at rectifying the injustices specifically towards trans, Black, and brown community members. And when you think about the perspective of our community, I ask you for your empathy in saying that law enforcement has the tools on its books. And it's important that we rectify the injustices. So again, as a proud member of our LGBT community, I ask for your support and your empathy at taking a look at this bill as it surgically rectifies the injustice in our criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lowe. Members, if you'd like to participate in debate, raise your microphones right now, please. Mr. Cooper, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This crime is a misdemeanor. It's the same as a broken window or doing a lawn job. It impacts much more people. And think about this. We're talking about, I've heard a lot of human trafficking references on this. A lot of juveniles are used in human trafficking. We know that, a lot of organizations out there. So this body, this legislature in here passed a bill a few years back where you cannot detain a juvenile suspected of being involved in prostitution. We banned that. So you can't stop somebody for that. You also can't interview a minor. So how do you rescue a minor that's being human trafficked if you can't detain him? That was passed here. You can't interview them. That was passed here to save them from a pimp. So a lot of these young girls, before you even heard the term of human trafficking, there was a lot of Black and brown girls that were being victimized by gangs, criminal street gangs, and now, in the years since, and it's taken off, human trafficking taken on a big thing. But that's real talk. I don't have a dog in this fight, but I've seen it out there. I've arrested people for this, and when someone's loitering out there, you see that a lot of the time. It's not rocket science. And maybe there is some discrimination cases. I'm not going to say there aren't. But for the most part, if you're out there driving around, you know who's out there working and who's not working. And especially those areas, you go to certain areas. That's how it is. But the part about it is those young girls out there. Like I said, what do we do then? How do we deal with that? I mean, if you want to, just decriminalize prostitution and make it simple. And some folks really want to do that. This is what it's done. You talk about the law enforcement toolbox. If someone can tell me right now, if you have a minor that is out there, and people use minors a lot, how does law enforcement tackle that? Because the way the laws are written and the laws that have been passed, there really is no way to tackle it and deal with it. I'm being honest with you. I've dealt with it. I've seen it personally. We see it on a daily basis. Some of you went out there the other day for the van out there doing ID. They deal with human trafficking. During COVID, it's blown up. Human trafficking, children being abused on the internet crimes against children. They get 4,600 cases a year here in Sacramento that they get tips on. They can't respond to all those tips. And a lot of them involve human trafficking. So I scratch my head is how do we deal with it? Yeah, it sounds good. People shouldn't be discriminated against, but not in all cases, but a lot of cases, you're out in this certain neighborhood and you're dressed like that, and you got I'm just saying, you got a purse full of condoms and stuff. It's just certain things like that you deal with it day in and day out, and you know who the players are and who they aren't, like I said. And if we really want to help minors, you talk about human trafficking, that's it. And by the way, in California right now today, present day, human trafficking of a minor to pimp a little kid is not considered a violent felony. So if you pimp a kid, guess what? Because of California's laws, you get released early from prison, which is also asinine. And so much money goes that we're always banging on human trafficking, but if we're going to bang on that, let's not just talk the talk, let's walk the walk and help them. And remember those bills, like I said, you can't interview a minor and you can't detain a minor for prostitution. A lot of minors see you come up, they give you the finger and just walk off because they've been told by their pimp, we can't talk to you. Don't talk to the cops, ignore the cops. They tell them that. That's why you're better off having minors because you can detain an adult much simpler than you can a minor. So this bill needs to be cooked. While well-intentioned, it's got a long ways to go, so I respectfully ask for your no vote on this.
Mr. Patterson.
Thank you, Speaker. Members, I rise asking you to think seriously about what we're doing here, and I want to align my comments with my friend from the Sacramento area and his experience. But let me tell you what we do in Fresno. We have a robust connection with many sex trafficking organizations that have safe houses and relationships with law enforcement. And it is tools like this that allow our police to separate the victim on the street with the pimp that's down the block and around the corner. And when we separate, they're not going to jail. They're going to a safe house. They're going to a place that cares for them. And those rescues are so oftentimes facilitated because there are processes and laws that can be used to identify the victim, but also separate them from the pimp. And unless you have seen this up close and personal, as I have and others in our community, I think it's difficult for you to fully understand why these tools matter. It is a protection for custody, keeping them away from the pimp that's going to beat them up, scare them to death, hurt them. That separation takes place, and then they are helped. These are the kind of tools, and they're being effectively used to rescue the victims. We need to maintain those kinds of tools, not because we're targeting, we're protecting. That's how we use it. It's why it needs to remain, because it's effective in saving, caring for, and transporting these individuals to safe houses and places where they can get help.
Dr. Weber, you are recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I was not planning on rising to speak on this bill, but just listening to the different arguments, there is a lot that we need to do to protect those who are being sex trafficked. Not just, and this responsibility does not just fall on the police officers, it falls on our education system, because many of these kids are in school system. It falls on us in the medical profession when they come into the emergency room for treatment and screening, and when we find out that they have either an infection or a pregnancy, and there's a lot of things that need to be done. But this bill really talks about profiling. And we've already said here on this floor that we don't agree with racial profiling, that if you're going to give somebody a gang enhancement, that you have to have proof. And so what this bill basically states is you can't arrest somebody for how they look, where they're walking, or who they may love. You need to actually catch them in that act. And so it's not a bill that's going to allow predators to take advantage of our youth. And like I said at the beginning, there's a lot that we need to do in a lot of different aspects of our society. We do need to do better. But this bill is about profiling. And we've already stated on this floor that this is not a state that is going to profile somebody based on their race, their gender, their sex. And that's why I asked for your aye vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. Ms. Petrie-Norris, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, too, had not intended to speak on this bill today, but I feel compelled to stand up because I understand that my inability to support this bill is deeply disappointing to many of my friends and many people that I care about. Here's the thing. we often vote on very well-intentioned pieces of legislation that have unintended consequences. We always need to be mindful of those unintended consequences. And for me, when the unintended consequence is making it more difficult to protect victims of child trafficking, even if that's just a possibility, that's not something that I can support. And so regrettably, I will not be able to support this bill today.
Members, if you'd like to participate in debate, I'm going to ask that you raise your microphones at this time. Mr. Bryan, you're
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. I will be exceptionally brief. There was an unintended consequence when we put this law on the books. The law, I believe, was righteously intended to help curb human trafficking. There has been absolutely zero data or evidence to suggest that it has, which is why it hasn't been cited on this floor. The unintended consequence that occurred is that black women and trans women have been profiled by law enforcement, resulting in over 60% of the people who are picked up for this charge being black women, being disproportionately trans. That's the unintended consequence. We made a mistake, and we need to roll it back. This doesn't prevent us from going after traffickers. It doesn't prevent us from going after people who are soliciting prostitution. We can still do that work, but we can do it without the profiling that's occurred from this law. I encourage an aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Bryan. Thank you, members. Ms. Bauer-Cahan, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank all the members for the robust discussion that we've had on this bill. But I also want to clear a couple things up, because a lot of things were said that are patently false. One of which was the focus on child trafficking. As my colleague from Elk Grove actually pointed out, that was decriminalized. The loitering for the purposes of prostitution for minors was decriminalized in SB 1322 in 2016, a bill carried by Senator Mitchell that my colleague from Palmdale was in fact a co-author on. So if you believe that loitering for the purpose of prostitution is a tool needed to end child trafficking, well, you should talk to whoever was in the legislature in 2016, because that was done. And this bill relates to people over the age of 18. So I just want to be really clear about that, about what the law does today and what this law will change, because I think there were a lot of misstatements of fact that were made in these debates. Secondly, my colleague from Fresno called this a tool. He used the word tool many times. It's a really nice word for criminalizing victims. It is not just a tool, members. This is a crime, and I want us to call it what it actually is. So if you believe that people who are loitering should be convicted of a crime, then do what you got to do. But it's not a tool, it's a crime. And these people will end up with a record that will stop them from getting housing and jobs and the future they deserve. And so I want us to be very clear about what this is. As a body, we passed $170 million in aid for victims, some of which goes to human trafficking victims. We, as a body, both sides of the aisle, believe deeply, and my colleague from Elk Grove spoke about a lot of things that maybe we should discuss doing differently about human trafficking. We all want to end human trafficking. I think every single one of us is in partnership with law enforcement who says we're losing the war on human trafficking. But CAST LA, which is the strongest advocate for human trafficking victims, supports this legislation. And so when the question was raised about what makes our community safer, I guess the question is, which communities do you care about? And the LGBTQ community is not safer with this law on the books. And as a longtime ally of LGBTQ plus rights, I am proud to stand in support of this bill today. And lastly, I know I'm probably not the only woman on the floor that was triggered when one of our colleagues said, well, they're dressed that way. How many of us have friends that have been raped who were told, well, you were dressed that way? Being dressed that way is not a crime. And it will never be okay to be victimized because you are dressed in any manner. And I want that to be clear to everybody who's watching and listening today. And with that, on behalf of every single one of our LGBTQ plus sisters and brothers, I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Clerk will open the roll. All members vote. Who desire to vote? All members vote. Who desire to vote? All members vote. Who desire to vote? Clerk will close the roll. Tally the vote. Ayes 41, noes 26. That measure passes.